Well, I just have to say that it really is an honor to be here. I am really pleased that you all invited me and that I was able to come, because I mentioned earlier some of my earlier connections to Michigan earlier on, but also that I think that this is just a really important area, and anytime I have a chance to try to spread a little propaganda, I will, so hopefully it'll be helpful. Okay. When I was asked about a topic for the keynote, I thought that it would be good to try to talk a little bit more generally about resilience. And I know that it's, probably pretty common now in terms of in the literature, and I was thinking a lot about that because I'd already designated the topic, but when reading the papers around 9/11, there was a lot of talk about that. And, some people think that resilience is something that is just innate, that we ought to be, that most of us are resilient, and that especially if you think about youth, they become more and more resilient as they experience things such as divorce or separation within the family or some kind of disaster. So we can watch towers fall down, and, as much as people were very much affected by that, others, coped. I had a friend that coped by shopping. She went bankrupt practically shopping because she felt that there wasn't going to be anybody to hold her to her bills. Really, she did. She spent a lot of money right after that, just watching all that. But that was her way of coping. But anyway, I just had to throw that in. But, we can watch, you watch people in California watch their houses go down the slide, mudslides, or the Chilean, miners. 33 miners came out after all that, and they were okay, So we've kind of got this idea that we are innately able to handle resilience. And sort of with that in mind, I want to kind of, break it down a little bit, okay? Just to kind of set the stage for many of you, you know these facts anyway, so it's kind of, you don't want to be hammered with it a lot. But let's just say, one thing about resilience is that's different than coping with stress is the fact that a person is competent, is still functioning in the midst of adversity. Okay, and they may even be stronger for it. It isn't just that they're coping, that after they get through whatever the crisis is, they learn something about being able to handle it that makes them a stronger person for whatever happens the next time. So these are some, facts that are really pretty startling, related to illnesses and with Native people. But the infant mortality rate is higher quite a bit. The death from alcoholism is 770% greater than mainstream population. The death from diabetes is 420% greater than mainstream population. The death from tuberculosis is 750% greater than mainstream population. By accidents, 280% greater. Death by suicide, 190% greater. So if you think about just the amount of loss that a person experiences by being connected to people within the communities, you can see that there's a lot of hardship, a lot of adversity that a person would go through. And as I said earlier, anytime you see an elder person, an elder Native person, you, by definition, are meeting a very resilient person. Okay. So in addition to these higher rates of, deaths that we mentioned, the rates of substance abuse, clinical depression, PTSD, violence, domestic violence, suicide, they're higher. And the important thing that I think is, then let's look at that in relationship to what services are available. And it's very sad to see that only 7% of the IHS budget is appropriated for mental health. That's one of the saddest things, is that we don't have, first of all, IHS budget is, it's always been underfunded. And then when you think of what proportion of it goes to mental health services, it's not very much. And they say that about 50% of the visits to the hospital are somehow related to mental health issues or behavioral health. That's what I hear, okay? And then when you think about how many Native people are professionals within the mental health field, and we do have more. The Society of Indian Psychologists is growing. And so from about the 1950s, there are approximately 150, maybe 175 Native psychologists and people that work in mental health, which is a great improvement, but still, when you look at that rate compared to the need out there, it's still, we have a long time before we get parity with other groups. I showed this slide this morning, and it's just emphasizing the differential rate in terms of suicide. Okay. So some other things of adversity that I think that are often talked about in the resilience literature is around parenting. Because in the early studies that Amy Warner did around resilience among Native Hawaiian people, undergoing extreme hardship, looking at longitudinal studies, some of the questions is, well, how did they have two parents? Or were they headed by a single parent? Or we also hear in the literature a lot about, well, even if the situation isn't very good at home, if those people who were resilient in that study had at least one caring adult in their life. Because over time they ask, what do you think made the difference for you, that you've been able to function well despite how hard it's been for you? And they would maybe mention a teacher or an older relative or someone, but they had some one caring person. So that's why we have often attention to issues about parenting in the resilience literature. So we know that more than 1/2 of all Native kids reside with only one parent. We know that Native women are less likely to ever marry and more likely to be divorced than women within the mainstream population. And we also know, though, that the extent of single parenthood, never marrying, and divorce is higher on reservations than in urban areas among Native people. Okay, so parenting issues are challenged. Okay. We also have, all kids go through, and it's hard, which is maybe the chronic illness or physical disability for themselves, maybe the death of a parent, maybe living with an alcoholic parent. These are things that are challenging. And then I have this one here because maybe I'm just super sensitive about it, living in the Bay Area. This is a picture off of Alcatraz Island looking at San Francisco. But the issue of invisibility. Now, I think here in the UP, probably people recognize who are Native people and, acknowledge them for that. But in the Bay Area, Native youth in San Jose, San Francisco, Oakland are often mistaken for being Latino. So, unless you know the person well, the casual observer won't even begin to recognize a person as being Native. And that's kind of, hard for young people. Add to that the issue of the mascot. We were sort of talking about that at lunch, and the stereotypes that are there. It's very hard for people knowing this. And one of the faculty members that work with, actually our new dean of the School of Education at Stanford is Claude Steele. And his work is on stereotype threat. And he's done a number of studies where the act of checking a box, be it, and he started with African American students at the University of Michigan in terms of their SAT scores, but he then moved into women in non-traditional fields like math and science. Just the act of checking the box before taking the exam can depress the figure, the score, the performance of a person. And then he went into, he's done a number of these studies, but just thinking about the stereotypes that are free-floating and how, youth or anyone really feels when they feel like they are being stereotyped. It's kind of depressing. And it goes on. But anyway, these are areas, very important areas. And if anybody wants any empirical evidence about the impact of stereotypes on Native American youth self-esteem, I would recommend the work of Stephanie Freiberg, F-R-Y-B-E-R-G, and she's done studies on this. And she used the image of Pocahontas and then Chief Illini, is that it? Illini from Illinois, and then this list of tragic Indian facts. and primed people beforehand. And priming is just a very quick image that you see, and you have to respond immediately so that you don't have time to edit out your response or, filter it out or think about it, rationalize it. And she found that the self-esteem of Native youth went down when primed with these, and the self-esteem of white youth went up when primed with these images, which is, I think, part of the reason why schools are reluctant to get rid of mascots, because for some people it improves their self-esteem. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here is set up a thought around the idea of the importance of prevention, because of the fact that, I talked earlier about trying to intervene with youth before they get into the habit of self-destructing or attempting as a way to handle things. And this image comes from a committee that I served on a few years ago with the National Academy of Sciences, in which we were to review the quality of the state of the field in terms of prevention interventions. And we wrote a book called Preventing Behavioral, Emotional, and Mental Disorders in Young People. And so this is a group of people that are into prevention, and what we're trying to say is this, that we know the blue bars are the ages of the first symptoms, when people start to see the symptom of ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, any anxiety, depression, substance abuse, substance dependence, or any diagnosis. So the blue bar is when you first start to see it. So like with ADHD, you start to see it around age 4, when a person enters school systems, preschool, kindergarten, etc. But then the purple is the part at which they are probably diagnosed. And what you see with ADHD is that this happens pretty fast because people are wanting them to behave. So they want them to calm down. And so they will get medication or whatever they do. Okay. But with the others, there's this window. See that space between where the blue bar and the purple is? And what we want to do is to intervene before it gets to be diagnosed. So once we see the symptom, intervene then, so it doesn't go to diagnosis. So we're calling this sort of like a prevention window, this window of opportunity to try to do something before one of these disorders becomes diagnosed. Okay? And with because it's going to be, once it's diagnosed, it follows you, okay? Once it's diagnosed, you're labeled, and the stigma associated with the label, the fact that you have something, as opposed to somebody noticed this about me, that's the internal part of it, okay? So mainly that. That's a good question. Thanks for asking that, Mari. Yeah, okay. And I think that oh, yes. Yes. The comment was, though, unfortunately, in order to get any services, you have to have a diagnosis. And so we tend to diagnose quickly in order for the person to get some services, which is, it's convoluted in a way. I mean, I know that that's the system, but it works against what I'm trying to talk about, right? Yeah. Okay. The way that I would say is through interventions that are in school. I'll get my story is through more mental health interventions in school systems and with families and in communities, not in mental health centers. Okay? What I'm trying to say is with prevention, we can keep people out of prison and we can keep people out of mental institutions, which is a lot more cost effective than what it costs to actually implement the kind of programs I'm talking about. So we're trying to if you just think about it from an economic perspective in terms of what it costs the taxpayer, it would be less. Okay, but you got to go around about it in a different kind of way than in the individually in the offices. Thank you. That's a good question. Okay. So anyway, when this business of resiliency first started coming up, that this was Amy Warner's study, and what she there was a lot of play about it because here were these youth that lived in really hard circumstances and ended up doing really well. So people started thinking about it. Well, there are certain people that are resilient. There's some people that are just resilient. It's almost like a trait, like IQ. There's a certain segment of the population that's resilient. Well, the thinking is a lot different than that now. And the thinking is kind of what I mentioned at the beginning, that everybody has the innate capacity to be resilient. All right. Everyone. Think about the baby that cries. All right. If a baby cries, they have a way of evoking in people some kind of annoyance, even among someone that might be trying to neglect them, to eventually pick them up. All right. Now, we know that if they aren't fed and if their diaper isn't changed and they aren't held, that they're not going to have the same experience as the person that has, really doting parents or caregivers, and that happens. So their experience of learning how they are going to be responded to in life starts out at a very young age. But technically, each one of those babies evokes something out of another human being if they're within earshot of them. So everyone has a capacity. It's just that some people have a different structure of reinforcement, and they get feeling good about their ability to do it sooner than maybe others. And the other thing is that we as a society have a responsibility to support people throughout their lives. So when you think what this is just a chart of different times in a person's life. So see, we have from 0 to 50. All right, and so at childbirth, and in infancy, in the first 5 years, there's the dotted arrows are stressors, and the ones coming down are protective processes. No, the protective processes are the solid lines. So we have stressors, and then we have protection. So yeah, they need more protection. Little ones do. And then when they get into 10, they don't need quite as much as they did when they were little. And then they go into adulthood, they don't need quite as much as they did. But yet then as we get into elder years, start moving on up into elder years, people need more protection. Okay? So the idea is that we need to be there like a scaffold when you're building something or washing windows on a skyscraper or something, but you need to be there to keep helping people along as they're going through different needs. And if those were happening uniformly to everyone in this society, we would have a thriving population. Okay, so I'm trying to get us to buy into the idea that the onus is on us to be part of that system of scaffolding people. Okay. All right. So rather than talk only about bleakness, part of the idea about resilience, too, is the idea that we have more protective factors than we have risk factors. That was what that image showed just a minute ago, all right? And I'm saying that in Indian country, we have a lot of protective factors. There have been, and I'm going to get more into spiritual thinking and spirituality in a moment, but we have more role models. I mean, we have so many more role models than years ago. And I don't like putting names on there in a way because then we're sort of like, there are many other people that could be up there. And the important part to think about, even in a lot of ways, is to remember that some of our best role models are our mothers and grandmothers at the kitchen table every morning or at the kitchen table at night. But basically, we're not talking, we're talking about a person that influences your life, okay? But I think if you just think even about look at the tribal college system. Look at all the role models provided by the tribal college system with 35 tribal colleges. And yes, I know that there's a lot of downside of casinos, but there also is a lot of improvement in terms of revenue that's generated by those casinos. And so, it's happening. We have somebody on the New York Stock Exchange now. Okay, we have doctors. We have, in law, I can't remember now. I was just rewriting an article on Changing and Diverse Roles of Native American Women, and I think it's something like 65% of Native attorneys are women now. And it just goes on within the profession. So the point is that there are plenty of role models, which is part of helping with the issue about resilience.
With their divorced husbands actually happy about that.
But I'm going to mention that in a minute, okay? Which is perfect for this slide, okay? Which is, all right, that motherhood is still a very valued role to Native communities. That children are still very valued, and some communities talk of them as gifts of life. They are the most recent people from the closest to the Creator okay? And I believe that the stigma of teen parenting isn't as great in Native communities. In addition to that, single parents often have additional support from partners. Okay, they might be married, they may not be married, but they do have within their family system someone that helps them. Okay, and getting back to the male thing, I'm going to get to that in a minute, but I want to say it while it's on here. Some of the research I'm going to show you is that I may be wrong, and this is a bias here. I think that in the process of splitting up, there isn't as much fighting. Now, maybe I'm wrong, or that maybe that the families have a better perspective on things and they don't have to take sides as much. So that I think that men, even if they are no longer with their partners anymore, still can have easier access to their children, maybe, in Indian communities. I don't know. It just doesn't seem like there's as much. But then again, that's a bias, and that's unique. I'm not going to go into that. And I'll get back to the point of the role of males in a minute. Okay. So, I didn't use a spell check this morning. I was up at 3 this morning redoing some of these slides. So I'm sorry about that one. Okay, but anyway, so I'm talking about protection through role models, protection through the one caring adult, and this one is, I'm going to say, protection through some type of social, emotional, developmental learning or skill building to be able to be resilient. Okay, and I showed you this slide for those of you who were here this morning, but the idea is that, there is a method in terms of stress and coping where we're trying to teach people through skills training to actually handle things directly in a planful way or an approach way rather than avoiding way. Okay. So people often ask me, what is approach coping? And I sort of mentioned it this morning, but I'll go over it. Being engaged in spiritual practices, but basically living a spirit-fulfilled life. Supporting people for taking action. Humor, problem solving, planning, positive thinking, and even this work now on mindfulness about really being able to accept some things that come to you that you really have no control over, but being able to take it in as something that we accept and can do. Okay, I'll go on. All right, so let me just give you, Dr. Carl Bell, who's in Chicago, has some interesting definitions of resilience. And I just want to go over a few of them. Resilience is having curiosity and intellectual mastery. And we do know when you study people that are deemed resilient, usually they can function well enough that they can get what they need. Okay, they have compassion, but with detachment. And the way I want to say that is, think of someone that is in a very chaotic family. Those people who are more resilient are somehow able to still be in that family, but pull away from it when it gets crazy. Okay? So being engaged, but also being able to withdraw from the situation enough to keep one's focus and sanity. Okay? Being able to conceptualize, obtaining the conviction of one's right to survive. Having the ability to attract and use support. Remember when I mentioned the baby is attracting attention, being able to, and people that are evocative. In other words, they make you kind of are drawn to them, that you want to respond to what they're asking, and some people you could care less about doing that. Having the need and ability to help others, having an affective repertoire, meaning that they have good, they are in touch with what their emotions are and that they can convey those things to others. Being resourceful, being altruistic to others, being caring about others, sharing, having the capacity to turn traumatic helplessness into learned helpfulness. Now, this is Dr. Bell. Now, this is why I think what you do is so very important, is that we have data that says that being engaged in cultural practices is a predictor of resilience. And we didn't used to. Everyone knew it intuitively. People have been telling this for generations, okay? But, in the world that I operate in, people say, well, show us the facts, give us the data. And so we do have data now. All right. So there are people, native scholars, that are writing about this. And to me, the first person that I encountered writing about this is Dr. Terry Cross. And he was the founder of the Indian Child Welfare Association many years ago. And he wrote a speech on resilience and applied these principles to the medicine wheel. And if any of you are interested in it, the speech is written in a book about Native families by Hamilton McCubbin, McCubbin, and his chapter is in there. But he basically says that resilience is finding balance, okay? This is not anything you don't already know. But basically that it's very important to have balance in all these aspects of life. And he begins, with this, with spirituality. And in the realm of the spirit, we know, in terms of prayer and meditation, and that. But what's important is that we know that just as there is good medicine, there is also bad medicine. And it's important to keep that in perspective and know, what you're doing, basically. Another, in terms of mind, he talked about the oral tradition. And he talked about how, some stories, of course, are to entertain. But many, many stories are to teach. And if you look at a lot of stories that have been handed down, they are really conveying a coping perspective. They're conveying how you handle it and how you cope with something. In terms of the body, he talked in that about kinship. He just chose to talk about kinship because of the resilience theme and this issue of parenting. And so he talked a lot to the men. And he said, even if you do not live where your children live, you still can have a very meaningful relationship to them. And it's very important for you to have that relationship. And then he talked about context. And he was saying it's very important for us to think about where things are happening and what is going on. And as an example, he talked about the family dinner table. What goes on at that table? It can be very constructive, but it can also be very destructive. So what is happening there? And so he goes on into that. So that's his story, but it's this framework. It's not a new one. Many people use this and think about this all the time in their prayer life. But it's kind of neat that he did that. I heard him give the speech a few years ago. It was really very powerful. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with the studies on resilience in American Indians? Between resilience studies and academic?
Mm-hmm. Can I get to that?
Oh, sure.
Can you hold that thought? Okay. I mean, I can do it, but, I'm a little out of order. Sure. Okay, we will talk about that. Okay, great. All right. So this one, when we were talking, you were asking about language today. This is neat. So what happened is, a few years ago, there was a study in the upper Midwest, that I was able to be a part of. And I was one of a team of people. I was the only psychologist. There were 2 sociologists and a political scientist. And I was able to, basically the data had already been collected, and I asked if I could do an analysis around resilience, because it looked to me from what we had collected that there could be a very relevant story there in terms of the data. And so that's what I was able to do, and I'm about to tell you that. But in the process then, my students and I started looking at all the literature we could find on resilience, and I started to try to find, is there anything we can find about Native American thinking around resilience? And we came across this dissertation, and it's by a woman named Barbara Graham, who's Anishinaabe, And she studied with Ann Maston at the University of Minnesota. And Ann Maston is like the guru of resilience literature. Okay, she's a developmental psychologist at the University of Minnesota. And so in Barbara Graham's dissertation, which I read, she is interviewing this elder named James Claremont, and she's asking him about the concept of resilience. And he says the closest translation of resilience in Lakota is a sacred word that means resistance. And I've been told that the word is wohitika. Okay? Resisting bad thoughts, bad behaviors. We accept what life gives us, good and bad, as gifts from the Creator. We try to get through hard times, stressful times with a good heart. The gift is the lesson we learn from overcoming it. And I thought it was interesting. That kind of message is sort of on your bag, isn't it, for this conference? The gift is the journey. Yeah. But anyway, this is what he says, okay, which is a very different way of looking at it. And from what I understand, that literally in Lakota, wohitika means fortitude. So it's kind of like adversity, but still being brave and strong while you're going through it, which is a higher order in thinking, I think, than some of these things that we're talking about in terms of resilience. Okay, so this study, basically this occurred on 3 reservations, 1 tribe. The people that were interviewed were early adolescents, their parents, and their grandparents. And if their grandparents were no longer present, they had a mentor grandparent, someone of that age that came to the house or interacted with the family at least a couple times a week. And they interviewed them. All were enrolled tribal members. Okay. And so basically, we also, part of the people in the sample lived off the reservation, but they didn't live any further than 50 miles away from the reservation, because we were interested in, did it make any difference if a person lived on the reservation or off the reservation. A third of them about 38% had lived in single-parent households that are predominantly female-headed. About a third of them had never lived with their biological fathers. About a third had lived with their biological fathers at some point in time in their lives. Okay? And this just shows you that the income level was variable across the families. And this shows you that this was a grant that was funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And we are trying to do prevention. So we're trying to prevent the onset of substance use. And we're doing this with middle school age students. So we're starting at age 11 or so. And you can see at age 10, about 18% of the girls are already using some substances, and about 8% or so of the boys, right? And then it dips down, and then the girls, they accelerate quicker than the boys, but then they kind of reach each other at about age 14, 15. But the idea is, if we were thinking about preventing it before it turned, the onset of the behavior, we weren't intervening early enough, right? But we were getting close anyway. So if we waited until high school, we wouldn't be preventing very much, right? Okay. All right, so this is neat. So what we did is the idea about resilience is a person that thrives despite adversity. And in the interviews, we were able to get information about their attitude towards school and their behavior in school. And so we created a category called pro-social behavior versus problem behavior. And this is the proportion of the students that in our study that were more, as you can see, significantly more were engaged in pro-social behavior than problem behavior. So most of those kids were, or more of those kids were resilient than not, you see? And the way we did that is that we had these questions about their attitude towards school. So school attitude, in other words, did they plan to go to college, an academic plan? And the light blue bars are pro-social, and the purple are problem. What about their school grades? Were they very good? Did they not engage in alcohol? Did they not do other substances? Were they not labeled as doing externalizing behavior, which is more anger out and things like that? So, they're a resilient group. Even though a little bit of experimenting with drugs, they're a resilient group. Right. So then what we had to do is say, okay, well, just because a person lives on the reservation doesn't mean that they're going through hardship, right? I mean, there's a lot of hardship, but the tribal chairman's children probably aren't going through as much hardship as some other families, right? So we needed to really have some other measure than the fact that a person lived on a reservation to distinguish hardship. So fortunately, through the parent interviews, we knew about whether they had were on food stamps or family assistance or below poverty rate or financial strain. And then we also knew from the parents whether the parents had ever been arrested for drugs, they'd ever used drugs, alcohol treatment, or currently binge drinking. And so between these two slides, what you see here is we really have two pretty solid groups that are clearly have experienced adversity in terms of finances. And then over here we have two solid groups really in terms of it, but maybe three solid groups. But basically what we did then is that we took out of the sample any of the ones that are in this, that have a combination of low adversity on either one of these two slides. Does that make sense? So in other words, if you fell in that category where you just happened to be very pro-social, but you had low adversity, we didn't count you in the sample. We took that out. So what we were trying to do is we were trying to say which ones in the pro-social group experience adversity, and then we had information about them, and we were trying to say, okay, this group we're testing what predicts their resilience. Okay, and here's what we found. Whether or not a person lived on the reservation didn't make any difference. If they lived on the reservation or as far away as 50 miles from the reservation, doesn't make any difference. Whether there's a father in the household, in this case, didn't make any difference in terms of resilience. Okay. Grades didn't make any difference. Age did, though. As the youth got older, they became less and less resilient because they experimented a lot more with risky behavior, or they got engaged in risky behavior. Maternal warmth was very significant. Now, we assessed maternal warmth and paternal warmth, but we didn't have that many fathers involved, so we couldn't keep it in the analysis. But clearly, parental warmth makes a big difference. So in other words, instead of, doing harsh discipline, setting some boundaries and being consistent, but being loving is very important in terms of resilience. And then this one on enculturation was significant. And the way we measured that is we had measures of their cultural identification, okay, and how identified they were with their tribal culture. We asked about their engagement in ceremonies, how important it was to them to go to ceremonies and how often they went. And then we had a list of 10 traditional activities. And these were activities that have been done for several generations that are considered traditional activities that still go on in the community today. And those three things combined was our enculturation measure. And it was significant. Right? And then the last one is perceived discrimination. And it was significant, but in a negative direction. So in other words, it undermines resilience when you experience racism and perceived discrimination. And these were things like, the clerk follows me around in the store, or my teacher doesn't expect me to get good grades, or things like that. Okay. So that was our study. So we were very happy that we were able to do this. Now, I also have another study that I did recently. I don't have a slide on it, where I was able to see that engagement in cultural activities deterred depression. And it is a longitudinal study in that it's over two time periods. So we found that. And then in answer to your question, Marty, about enculturation, there's an article out in the Journal of American Indian Ed a few years ago. I can give you the citation. But we found that definitely made a difference in terms of their academic engagement, their academic interests, using those, and we use those same measures because it's from this data set. Okay? But so we're finding that out. Okay, thank you. All right, so I just like these slides. These were done at Wapaton Indian School, and my sister-in-law gave them to me. But basically, these things are right on. What people do in Indian education is very important, right? And so here's some things from Carl Bell again. Well, how do you build resilience? Well, I'm mentioning some by these skills training, things like that. But he's saying it's almost like building muscles. I mean, you don't just do it once. You build it. You pump up, you get strength, and if you don't exercise it, you lose it. If you don't use it, you lose it. So in other words, that idea again that we need to throughout life keep supporting. And I'm really in touch with that now as I'm reaching my period in life, and I'm seeing some of my friends and all that, and what we need to do to kind of help each other keep up and keep going and get out to the gym and whatever else we have to do. Okay. Another is to expand partnerships for the purpose of resilience. So sort of like rebuilding the village. It's there. And that's what, I don't know if any of you remember Dr. Carolyn Atneve. She did a lot about network therapy, but basically her goal was just to rekindle the network because it's there. So in other words, activate it. Okay? And then he also says that this emotional resilience that we're talking about relies on having decent health. So when he uses as an example, it's very hard for a person to become bright or do well cognitively if they are exposed to lead and we don't even know it. So there's an example of the tie, okay? Improving the bonding, the attachment, the connectedness, and that certainly is the theme of the CDC. Thank you. In terms of CDC, in terms of suicide prevention now, is increasing connectedness, giving them the ability to do the skills I mentioned before, and then providing family interventions to promote it and that kind of thing. Okay, so thank goodness I got a little bit of time now to talk about the big kicker. All right, here we are. Now, this comes also from that report that I was talking about from the National Academy of Sciences, but and I'm sorry that it isn't more obvious in terms of the print, but let me just go through it. What we've got is, when are the opportunities to intervene? Think about it. All right, we have from prior to conception to young adulthood. So we have pregnancy prevention, right? And we have Planned Parenthood. In other words, so that people are thinking about what they're doing prior to conception and in prenatal times. We have home visits, right? Often social worker, nurse comes after, at least at the birth of the first baby in a family. But we have these home visiting programs. And David Old's program of the nurse home visiting is very effective. They have shown, even that visit just with the baby, they've followed those children up into adulthood, and they see that those whose parents went through this nurse home visiting program use a lot less substances than those that didn't get it. Okay, so there's goes on between prenatal and infancy. Okay, then we have early Head Start, right? We have early Head Start programs. Great. We have Head Start programs. We already have those things. Okay, and then we often think, when we think about offering parenting skills, we often think about it for first-time parents or with parents of young children, and then we stop. But in reality, it's a challenge to parent children all through their childhood, right? Okay, and so what this group is saying, that we should be offering parenting support throughout the life of a parent, directly parenting. And that could be through, there are these programs. There's this one called called Transitions by Tom DeShawn, where they have at the middle school level transitioning from elementary to middle school. They have a half-time parent coordinator from the community that works in the school, and they have an office, and they have resources. Because at that stage, people don't want to go through parenting classes. They don't want to be told how to parent, but they certainly need information. and that person that works in the school knows what's going on with children in the school. So they can find out from that person what's going on with their child rather than having to go through talking to the teacher. Okay, so that's phase one. Then phase two is he talks about a family checkup. Now, I don't know how many of your parents would be interested in once a year somebody coming to their house and talking to them about their parenting. But that is the next stage, and then the third would be treatment if people needed it. But the idea is that parenting support should always be there for parents. And then we have the next line after that is social and behavioral skills training, and then also classroom-based curricula to prevent substance abuse, aggressive behavior, and risky sex. And that should be going on through adolescence. And then he starts talking, the next line down is the prevention of depression. Because you see, we usually don't see serious depression in youth until about puberty. And so he's saying from that point into adulthood, there are prevention programs for depression. And we should be offering that. And there is also now new evidence that there are prevention programs to prevent schizophrenia. So for people who have schizophrenia in their families, this is an incredible breakthrough, that there really are. And it's been approved, basically studied a lot by this committee, the National Academy of Sciences, Institute of Medicine, hope that there can be a way to prevent schizophrenia. And then he's going on about, I have to look at this. Wanting to do preventing family adversities such as bereavement, divorce, parental psychopathology, parental substance use, parental incarceration. In other words, across the lifespan, there ought to be something to help people that are dealing with that. And then finally, across, community interventions across the lifespan and policy across the lifespan. But this is our idea of the scaffold. Do you see what I mean? That could be there if communities would be sort of rekindled to think about what is available, because all this doesn't have to take federal funding in order for it to happen, because it probably already does happen to some extent, but could be rekindled within families or clans or groups, so that but the idea being that we got to do more than just a few parenting skills classes, and then let everybody be on their way, because that's about where it stops now. Yes. Well, I mean, this is just reviewing all the evidence base and what are considered to be effective programs. And I would imagine that probably Family First is based on some of this literature. Wouldn't you think? I think, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I know it's time to wrap up, but the whole point here is that this is a treatment wheel, and and this is idealistic. But what we do right now in terms of mental health funding is we spend most of the money in this half circle goes to treatment and maintenance. And this group is trying to say that we should have equity or parity between prevention, health promotion and prevention, as much as treatment and maintenance. And that's idealistic, but that's what we're trying to aim for, okay? And so just in conclusion, if you want the names of people on the committee, I can share it with you. But I just want to say this is the source. It's called National Research Council Institute of Medicine, Preventing Mental, Emotional, and Behavioral Disorders Among Young People. You can get it by just going on the web to the National Academy of Sciences and going to their publication. And I think that it's still online there, that you can download it. You don't necessarily have to buy the book. So with that, thank you very much.